Park Seo-joon did not make mistakes. He made decisions, and every decision he had ever made was built on a single, immovable foundation: never let anything inside the operation that you cannot control. At 29, he was already the kind of man that other dangerous men lowered their voices to discuss. Sharp black suit. Sharper mind. A face that looked like it had been carved from the same cold material as the city he commanded, all clean angles and controlled expression, the kind of stillness that didn't read as peace, but as the moment before consequence. He sat at the head of his conference table the way a king sits at the edge of a war, not braced for it. Ready for it. The interviews had been running for 2 hours. 6 candidates. 6 disappointments. The first one had smiled at him too slowly. The second had laughed at something he hadn't said. The third had worn a blouse cut low enough to be a conversation he had no interest in having. One by one, Seo-joon had looked at each of them, not unkindly, simply accurately, and said the same thing in the same tone a man uses to end a meeting that should never have been scheduled. "Thank you for your time. My assistant will see you out." They were too young. Too transparent. Too aware of the mythology attached to his name and too interested in becoming part of it. He didn't need mythology in his office. He needed precision. He needed someone who could walk into a room full of the most dangerous men in Seoul and organize the agenda without once looking for an exit or an audience. He needed, in short, someone with nothing to prove and no interest in proving it to him. "Send in the last one," he said, without looking up from the file in front of him. The door opened. And the sound was different. Not the quick, self-conscious click of heels that wanted to be noticed. Something slower. Deliberate. The unhurried cadence of a woman who had decided, long before she walked into this building, exactly who she was, and had not consulted the room for confirmation. Park Seo-joon looked up. Vanessa Hughes crossed the threshold at 46 with the quiet authority of a woman who had already lived the life that other people were still auditioning for. She was elegant in the way that had nothing to do with effort: deep burgundy blouse, perfectly fitted dark trousers, a single strand of pearls that sat against her skin like punctuation at the end of a sentence that didn't need emphasis. Her hair was swept back, clean and certain. And her expression. He had expected nerves. He always saw nerves, even when people tried to hide them. A microtension in the jaw, a blink held a half-second too long, the slight overcorrection of someone trying to look comfortable. Vanessa Hughes looked comfortable. Genuinely, effortlessly, almost irritatingly comfortable. She set her portfolio on the edge of his table, not handed it to him, not pushed it forward with an eager lean, simply placed it there, as if she were returning something that already belonged to the room, and then she met his eyes. Not with challenge. Not with the practiced softness of someone hoping to be chosen. She met his eyes the way someone meets the eyes of a problem they've already assessed and filed under manageable. Seo-joon picked up the portfolio. The credentials were immaculate. 17 years of high-level operational management. Fluent in 3 languages. She had run the private offices of 2 government ministers and, before that, a financial institution whose books, he happened to know, covered considerably darker business than lending. She had seen power. She had organized it, archived it, and apparently walked away from it twice without being asked. He looked up from the page. "You're overqualified for this position, Ms. Hughes." It was not a compliment. It was a probe. The first pressure point, the one he used to find the crack in composure. Everyone had one. Vanessa tilted her head, precisely 1 degree. "Then you'll waste less time training me," she said. Her voice was even, unornamented, and carried the particular kind of calm that belongs to women who have been underestimated so many times it has simply become background noise. "I'm not here for the title, Mr. Park. I'm here because the role fits. The question is whether the organization fits me." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. In 4 seconds, Park Seo-joon, who had stared down rival bosses, walked out of ambushes, and once sat across from a man who had a weapon pointed at him under the table and never blinked, felt something shift in the carefully maintained atmosphere of his own office. She was not trying to impress him. She was, without raising her voice or moving from where she stood, quietly interviewing him. He closed the portfolio. Monday. 7 a.m. He held her gaze. Don't be early. I don't like people in my space before I've had coffee. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more contained than that, the expression of a woman acknowledging a minor detail that she had already anticipated and filed accordingly. Noted, said Vanessa Hughes, picked up her bag, and walked out. Seo-jun sat in the silence she left behind and stared at the closed door for longer than he would later be willing to admit. He had hired her to solve a problem. He would spend the next 3 months slowly, helplessly realizing she was the problem, and that there was no operational solution for the way a room felt emptier every time she left it. The morning had started the way most of Seo-jun's morning started, with complete, efficient control over every variable in the room. By 10 o'clock, that control was becoming tedious. His head of security, Min, had arranged the candidates in the outer corridor in order of their scheduled times, each one seated in the kind of rigid, performance-ready posture that told Seo-jun everything he needed to know before they opened their mouths. He could see them through the glass partition, the careful way they crossed their ankles, checked their reflections in the dark screens of their phones, rehearsed expressions of calm competence that were anything but calm. They knew who he was. That was the problem. Everyone who walked into this building knew who Park Seo-jun was, and that knowledge changed people before they even reached his door. It made them smaller, or it made them reach, and neither version was useful to him. He didn't need admiration in his office. He didn't need nerves, or ambition, or the particular kind of hunger that attached itself to proximity to power like a second skin. He needed someone who could hold the operational weight of his world without flinching, without scheming, and without once looking at him like he was something to be obtained. The first candidate came in bright-eyed and over-prepared, her answers rehearsed to a polish that had long since worn through to something hollow underneath. She smiled twice before she sat down. That was already one smile too many. Thank you, Seo-jun said, before she finished her second sentence. Min will see you out. The second arrived with a leather-bound notebook she had clearly never written in. The third answered every question directed at her qualifications by somehow redirecting it toward him, his firm, his reputation, his vision. As though she had come to interview his mythology rather than discuss her competence. He didn't finish the question before he ended it. By the fifth, Seo-jun had stopped looking at the door. He was reviewing an acquisition document, a legitimate one, or at least legitimate enough to survive scrutiny, when Min's voice came through the intercom. Last candidate, sir. Send her in. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the line he was reading, set the document to one side, and then, only then, raised his eyes to the door. She was already inside. He hadn't heard her enter the way he'd heard the others. There was no pause at the threshold, no moment of gathering herself before crossing into his space. She had simply come in, the way someone enters a room they have decided to be at ease in, and was now standing 3 feet from his desk with the kind of stillness that didn't broadcast itself. Park Seo-jun looked at her. 46, the file had said. He registered that now, confirmed it in the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, in the particular quality of her composure, not the composure of someone suppressing nerves, but of someone who had lived long enough past the things that used to rattle her that they no longer even registered on the way in. She was dressed precisely, dark trousers, a deep burgundy blouse, pearls at her throat that weren't a statement but a signature. Her hair was back. Her hands were still. She set her portfolio on the edge of his desk, placed it, rather than offered it, and then she looked at him. And she waited. No smile. No preamble. No performance. Just a woman standing in a room, entirely at home in her own presence, waiting to see what he would do next. Seo-jun picked up the portfolio. The credentials held 17 years at a level of operational management that most people in legitimate business never reached, and she had done it twice over in environments that, reading between the documented lines, were not entirely unlike his own. She had organized power. She had stood close to it, kept it running, and walked away from it with her name intact and her record clean. That last part was not common. That last part was, in his world, almost remarkable. "You're overqualified," he said. The words were flat, diagnostic. He watched her face for the response, the flash of hope, the modulation of tone that meant she was about to sell herself. She tilted her head, exactly 1 degree. "Then you'll spend less time correcting my work," she said. Unhurried. "I'm not here for the title, Mr. Park. I'm here because the position fits. Whether this organization fits me is still something I'm assessing." The room was quiet. In the corridor, he could feel Min's carefully neutral presence on the other side of the glass, very deliberately not reacting. In the 17 months Min had worked for him, no one had said anything like that in this office. Not to Park Seo-jun. Not in this building. Seo-jun looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he set the portfolio down. Monday. 7 a.m. He held her gaze. "Don't be early. I don't like people in my space before I've had coffee." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, not quite, but the contained acknowledgement of a woman who had expected exactly this and had already filed it appropriately. "Noted," Vanessa Hughes said, retrieved her bag, and left. Seo-jun did not immediately return to the acquisition document. He sat in the quality of silence that she left behind, a silence that felt, in a way he could not immediately categorize, different from the silence that had existed before she walked in, and looked at the closed door for a long moment. He had hired her because she was the solution to a problem. He did not yet know that she was also the beginning of one. By Friday of the first week, 3 things had changed in the operational structure of Park Seo-jun's office that he had not authorized, had not been consulted on, and could find absolutely no grounds to reverse. The first was the scheduling system. His previous assistant had maintained a calendar that Seo-jun had privately regarded as a diplomatic fiction, meetings listed without priority sequencing, conflicts quietly buried under optimistic time estimates, buffer gaps that disappeared the moment someone with enough rank decided they needed 5 minutes. He had adapted to it the way people adapt to a recurring inconvenience, by working around it rather than through it, arriving early, staying late, absorbing the friction as the cost of moving through a world that could not quite keep up with him. On Tuesday morning, Seo-jun opened his schedule and found it restructured. Not adjusted, restructured. The meetings were reordered by operational urgency, each one bracketed with realistic transition time, the recurring afternoon conflict he had silently rearranged in his head every day for 6 months simply gone, resolved by a 15-minute shift that apparently no one before Vanessa had bothered to implement. There was a single line at the bottom of the updated document. Previous format created an average of 40 minutes of daily inefficiency. New structure recovers it. VH. He read it twice. Then he moved on. The second change was the filing architecture for the firm's above-board legal documentation, the surface layer of the operation that interfaced with the legitimate world. What Seo-jun had inherited was a system built by 3 different people at 3 different times, each one working in logical isolation from the others, producing a structure that technically contained everything and practically delivered nothing without significant excavation. He had learned its peculiarities over years, navigated them automatically, the way someone navigates a familiar road with too many unnecessary turns. On Wednesday, the system had new logic. Clean, indexed, cross-referenced. Everything where it should be, labeled in a way that assumed the person looking for something was operating under time pressure, because in this office, they usually were. No note this time. Just the work, done. The third change he didn't discover directly. Min told him about it, on Thursday afternoon, with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that the safest position when reporting to Park Seo-joon was the one with the fewest editorial additions. One of the external contractor accounts, a regular arrangement for operational support that existed on paper as a logistics consultancy, had been quietly overbilling for 14 months. Small amounts, varied intervals, the kind of number that fell below the threshold of anyone's direct attention and above the threshold of genuine significance when accumulated. Vanessa had found it in the financial review she had apparently conducted during her first 2 days without being asked, flagged the discrepancy, and contacted the contracting party directly to issue a correction notice. She had informed the contractor before she informed Seo-joon. He sat with that for a moment. Then he moved on. What he could not move on from, and what he was still standing at the edge of when it happened, was the conversation in the corridor on Friday afternoon. Seo-joon had been in the doorway of his office, not listening, not watching, simply present at the periphery of a building he moved through differently than other people moved through spaces that belonged to them. He knew the sound of his own operation the way a musician knows their instrument, every frequency, every variance. Which was why he heard the shift in the hallway before he turned to look. Ryan, his most senior lieutenant, 14 years in the organization, a man whose loyalty was absolute and whose tolerance for anything he hadn't personally approved was historically limited, was standing in the corridor outside the document room. Vanessa was in front of him, a folder in one hand, her expression as settled as it always was, which was to say entirely, which was to say in a way that clearly irritated Ryan considerably. Seo-joon couldn't hear the beginning of it. He caught the middle, Ryan's voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to remind someone of the distance between their positions, a tone that had ended more than a few conversations before they became arguments. Vanessa let him finish. Then she said something, measured, quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't lower itself for the room but simply occupies the space it has decided to occupy, and Ryan's expression moved through 3 distinct stages in approximately 4 seconds. The first was dismissal. The second was recalibration. The third was a stillness that, in Ryan's face, Seo-joon had never seen produced by anything that wasn't a direct order from him. Vanessa tucked the folder under her arm, said one more thing that Seo-joon was too far away to catch, and walked back toward the outer office without looking back. Ryan stood in the hallway. Seo-joon stood in his doorway. For a moment, both of them were simply still, in different places in the building, each processing the same information through entirely different frameworks. Min appeared at Seo-joon's elbow with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to arrive exactly when something needed to be documented and depart before it needed to be discussed. "Should I?" "No," Seo-joon said. He stepped back into his office and returned to his desk. He did not examine what had just happened. He did not identify the particular quality of the thing he had felt, standing in that doorway, watching Ryan recalibrate in the presence of a woman who had been inside this building for 5 days. He filed it under operational observation and told himself that was accurate. By the time he left that evening, he almost believed it. The briefing was scheduled for 11 and running by 3 minutes past, which in Seo-joon's operation was the functional equivalent of being late. There were 4 of them in the room, Seo-joon at the head of the table, Ryan to his left, and 2 of his most trusted operational managers, Do-won and Choi, arranged along the side with the particular attentiveness of men who understood that these meetings were not discussions but sequential confirmations of decisions already forming in one person's mind. Vanessa sat at the far end, a step removed from the table's central geometry, a legal pad in front of her and a pen she hadn't yet used. She was there to document. That was the understanding. Seo-joon moved through the first 3 items efficiently. A shipment logistics revision. A personnel adjustment in the Southern District. A legal matter that required quiet handling through one of 3 firms on their approved list, each one chosen for its competence and its discretion in approximately equal measure. The 4th item was the port acquisition. He had been positioning for it for 8 months, a controlling stake in a mid-sized freight operation that sat at a logistically critical junction between 2 of his primary distribution networks. The surface transaction was clean. The deeper structure of it was, like most things in his world, considerably more layered. The arrangement required moving a significant sum through an intermediary holding company, one that had served the organization reliably for several years and whose ownership chain was deliberately difficult to trace. Seo-jun laid out the timeline. Clean, direct, no wasted language. The money would move in 2 tranches. The intermediary would absorb the first, hold the documentation for 72 hours, and clear the second after confirmation from their legal team. He had used this structure before. It worked. He was 3 sentences from closing the item when Vanessa spoke. The holding company filed amended registration documents 6 weeks ago. The room did not go quiet so much as it recalibrated, a collective, invisible adjustment, like the air pressure shifting before weather. Do-won's pen stopped moving. Choi's eyes moved to Seo-jun, then immediately back to the table. Ryan went still in the specific way he went still when he was deciding whether something required a response and had not yet reached a conclusion. No one spoke. No one, in this room, in this building, in the considerable operational history of this organization, had interrupted Park Seo-jun in the middle of a financial directive. Seo-jun looked at her. Vanessa did not look away. She was not performing composure, she simply had it, the same way she always had it, as though the concept of this room being a dangerous place to hold a contrary opinion had genuinely not registered as relevant to the question she was answering. The amended registration changed their primary jurisdiction from domestic to offshore. Under the new structure, the second tranche would trigger a mandatory disclosure to a regulatory body that did not exist in their original filing territory. She set her pen down. It won't surface immediately. It will surface in approximately 90 days, which, based on the acquisition timeline, would be during the documentation review period when the transaction has already cleared but before final registration completes. She said it the way she said everything, measured, without editorial weight, as though she were describing a scheduling conflict rather than a structural flaw in an 8-month strategy that sat inside a framework with consequences considerably more serious than a missed meeting. The window is the problem, not the structure, she added. If the intermediary is replaced with the secondary holding arrangement that was used for the Eastern District transfer in March, the disclosure trigger doesn't apply. The timeline extends by 11 days. That's the cost. 11 days. Seo-jun looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that Ryan shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. Long enough that Do-won found something important to examine in the middle distance. He had not known about the amended registration. His legal team had not flagged it. Ryan, whose job included exactly this category of structural oversight, had not flagged it. The woman who had been inside his operation for 9 days and was supposed to be taking notes had caught what a room full of people whose entire professional existence was structured around not missing things had collectively missed. 11 days, Seo-jun said. 11 days, Vanessa confirmed. Neutral. Not waiting for gratitude or acknowledgement. Simply confirming a data point. He looked at Ryan. Rebuild the intermediary structure around the March arrangement. New timeline runs from today. Ryan nodded once, the nod of a man absorbing 2 things simultaneously, the instruction and the fact of what had just produced it, and wrote something in his notebook that Seo-jun suspected was not related to the instruction. The briefing closed 8 minutes later. Do-won and Choi left efficiently. Ryan paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked back at Seo-jun with the expression of a man who had a question he was constructing very carefully. Are you? Close the door, Seo-jun said. Ryan closed the door. Seo-jun stood at the window. Below, the city moved with its usual indifference, traffic and commerce and the 10,000 daily transactions of a world that continued operating whether or not anything significant had just occurred inside a room on the 14th floor. He was not thinking about the acquisition. The acquisition was solved. That was a closed item. He was thinking about the pause before she spoke. The way she had held the information, not as leverage, not as performance, but simply as something that needed to be said because it was accurate, and accuracy was, apparently, what she brought into every room she entered as a matter of course. He pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass and let the city hold his focus for a moment. He was not all right. He was, for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, genuinely interested in how another person's mind worked. That was a significantly more complicated problem than the port acquisition. It started with the files. Seo-jun noticed it on a Wednesday, which meant it had probably been true since the Monday of her first week, and he had simply not allowed himself to catalog it until the Wednesday of her third. She carried files the way certain people carry themselves through a room, without announcing it, without adjusting for the audience, in a way that was so entirely consistent it eventually became impossible to overlook. Unhurried. Certain. The folder held at her side rather than clutched to her chest, her pace unchanged whether she was moving through an empty corridor or navigating a hallway full of men who tracked her passage with the instinctive attention that competence tends to produce in people who recognize it. He noticed it. He noted that he had noticed it. He filed it under observation and returned to his work. The second thing was the pause. He had initially read it as deliberation, the half-second she took before responding to a question as though she required the time to locate the answer. He understood, by the third week, that this was not what it was. The pause was not retrieval. It was selection. She already had the answer. She had arrived at it before he finished the sentence, processed it against 2 or 3 alternative framings, and was using the half-second to determine which version of the truth was most useful for the specific room she was currently in. It was, he recognized with a neutrality he made a point of maintaining, exactly what he did. The difference was that he had spent years learning to do it invisibly. She simply did it, without apparent effort, as though it had never occurred to her that it was a skill rather than a reflex. He told himself this was relevant professional intelligence. An assessment of her operational value. He was doing this more often now, the reclassification of things that didn't require classification into language that made them feel like they did. The third thing was the way she looked at the empire. Or rather, the way she didn't. Every person who moved through Park Seo-jun's world looked at it with something: hunger, fear, calculation, the particular brightness of people who understood they were adjacent to power and were constantly, quietly measuring the distance between themselves and it. His lieutenants wore their loyalty like a second skin, but underneath it the awareness of what they were loyal to was always present, always slightly electric. Even Min, whose professionalism was genuine and whose discretion was absolute, carried a baseline vigilance that was inseparable from knowing what kind of man he worked for. Vanessa looked at the operation the way a structural engineer looks at a building. Not with awe. Not with appetite. With the level, practiced assessment of someone taking inventory, identifying what was load-bearing, what was decorative, what would hold and what would eventually need attention. She had seen power before. She had organized it, maintained it, and filed it correctly, and whatever conclusions she had drawn from that proximity she had drawn a long time ago and did not feel the need to revisit. She was not impressed by him. This was, Seo-jun had come to understand, the most unsettling thing about her. Not because his ego required impression, he had long since stopped needing the room to reflect his importance back at him. But because every system of social navigation he had ever built assumed, at its foundation, that people wanted something from Park Seo-jun. They wanted his protection, his money, his approval, his fear, his attention. The wanting was the constant. It was what he read, managed, leveraged, and occasionally rewarded, and it was what allowed him to understand, at any given moment, exactly where he stood in relation to every person in his world. Vanessa Hughes did not appear to want anything from him. She wanted the work done correctly. She wanted the operation to run without unnecessary friction. She wanted, as far as he could tell, her coffee at a specific temperature in the morning and the window in the outer office left partially open in the afternoon, and beyond that she seemed to require very little from her environment, including him. He could not locate himself in her system of wanting. He had no coordinates. He began arriving earlier. Not dramatically, 15 minutes, occasionally 20, within the range of what could be attributed to traffic variance or the kind of schedule adjustment that any rigorous professional might make without meaning anything by it. He told himself, the first morning, that he had work to review before the day began in earnest. He told himself, the second morning, that the earlier start gave him cleaner thinking time. By the fourth morning he had stopped constructing the justification entirely, which was in some ways more honest and in other ways considerably more inconvenient. She was always already there. This, too, he had not anticipated. He had not considered that arriving early to a space would deliver him earlier into the specific quality of quiet that existed when Vanessa was in the room, a quiet that was different from the quiet of an empty office, more settled, more inhabited, the kind of stillness that exists when the room has been organized by someone who knows what it is supposed to be. She would look up when he came in. A brief acknowledgement, not deferential, not warm, simply accurate, the way she acknowledged most things. Then she would return to whatever she was doing, and Seo-jun would move to his office and sit at his desk and be entirely unable to identify what, specifically, he had arrived early for. He was a man who built his world on knowing exactly what he wanted and exactly how to secure it. He was starting to suspect that this particular situation was not going to cooperate with that architecture. He opened his files. He read the same paragraph 4 times. Outside his door, he could hear the unhurried, certain sound of her moving through the morning, and he told himself, with decreasing conviction, that he was simply noting it. The meeting was held on neutral ground, which in practice meant a private dining room on the 32nd floor of a hotel that belonged, through 3 layers of holding structure, to neither organization. Neutral ground in Seo-jun's world did not mean safe ground. It meant that the weapons in the room were the kind that didn't require metal detectors. Chairman Oh Byung-soo was 61 years old, which in the architecture of Seoul's criminal landscape was not an age so much as an achievement. He had outlasted 4 attempted consolidations, 2 government investigations, and at least 1 arrangement that was supposed to have ended his operation permanently and had instead ended the people who designed it. He was compact, unhurried, and dressed with the specific understatement of a man who had nothing left to prove through appearance. He smiled often. Seo-jun had learned, through sources whose reliability had been confirmed at considerable cost, that the smiling meant nothing. It was atmospheric, like weather, present regardless of what was actually being planned underneath it. Seo-jun arrived with Ryan and Vanessa. Oh arrived with 2 men whose function was obvious and a lawyer whose function was less so. They arranged themselves on opposite sides of the table with the practiced ease of people who had done versions of this enough times that the choreography had become automatic. The first 40 minutes were architecture. Territory adjacencies, the redistribution of 2 contested logistics routes, a financial arrangement involving a port-adjacent operation that both organizations had been quietly circling for the better part of a year. Seo-jun negotiated the way he did everything, with an economy of language that communicated, without stating, that he had already accounted for every available counterposition and was offering terms rather than opening a conversation. Vanessa sat at his right, slightly back from the table's central line. She was not introduced and did not introduce herself. She had her legal pad and she used it, notating, cross-referencing, catching the numerical details that moved through high-level conversations like undercurrents, present to anyone who knew how to read the water beneath the surface language. Twice, Seo-jun paused mid-statement and she placed a single document in front of him without being asked, the right document, the right moment, the right page already facing upward. Oh noticed. Seo-jun registered that Oh noticed and filed it and continued. They were 48 minutes in when the architecture concluded and Oh leaned back in his chair with the relaxed quality of a man transitioning from business to something he found more interesting. He lifted his tea. He let a moment pass in the particular way that experienced men let moments pass when they are deciding where to apply the next pressure point. Then he looked at Vanessa. "You have excellent staff, Seo-jun," he said. His voice carried the warmth of genuine observation, which was the most dangerous register it ever occupied. "I've sat across from a lot of men in this business. Most of them bring people to these meetings to look formidable. He tilted his head slightly, the smile present and ambient and entirely without content. Yours actually understands what's being discussed. That's unusual. He let it rest there. Dressed as a compliment. Weighted as an assessment. The kind of remark that contained, for anyone fluent in the language being spoken, a question inside a question: who is she, what is she to you, and what would happen if I reached in that direction to find out? The room held itself carefully still. Ryan's pen was motionless against his notebook. O's two men were watching Seo Jun with the professional attentiveness of people whose job was to read reactions. The lawyer had stopped writing. Seo Jun looked at O. What happened next took no time at all. There was no calculation, no selection process, no half-second pause while he chose from available responses. The answer was simply present, the way reflexes are present, not decided but revealed. Ms. Hughes is not a subject for this table, Seo Jun said. His voice had not changed in volume or in temperature. It had changed in something more precise than either of those things, a quality that the men in the room, all of whom had spent their professional lives learning to read exactly this kind of signal, received with complete clarity. Not a warning. A demarcation. The kind of line that isn't drawn but simply indicated, the way a man indicates the edge of something by the way he positions himself in relation to it. If the logistics terms are settled, I'd like to move to the timeline. O held his gaze for one moment. Then he smiled, differently this time, with something in it that had not been there before, something that looked almost like satisfaction, and set down his tea. Of course, he said. The timeline. The meeting concluded 11 minutes later. Clean, documented, the terms clear on both sides. They stood, they exchanged the minimal courtesies that the situation required, and Seo Jun moved toward the door with the same controlled efficiency he brought to every exit. In the elevator, Ryan stood at his left. Vanessa stood at his right. The floor numbers descended in silence. Seo Jun looked straight ahead at the closed doors. He had revealed something. He understood this with the cold precision of a man conducting a real-time damage assessment, cataloging what had been exposed, to whom, and what they were likely to do with the information. Oh, Byung-soo was not a man who filed things and forgot them. He was a man who filed things and waited, patiently, for the moment when they became most useful. What Seo Jun could not assess, and this was the part that stayed with him, past the lobby, past the car door, past the first several minutes of the drive back through the city, was the speed of it. He had not chosen to respond that way. He had not waited. He had simply responded, from somewhere below the level at which he was accustomed to operating, as though the question of her had already been settled in a part of him that hadn't bothered to consult the rest. Outside the window, Seoul moved past in its usual indifferent continuity. Vanessa looked at her legal pad. She was reviewing her notes, pen moving in small, precise strokes, entirely composed, giving no indication of having registered what had happened at that table, or of having registered, with equal calm, exactly what it meant. Seo Jun said nothing. The car moved through the city, and the silence between them was the most honest thing that had happened all day. Ryan took a separate car. This was standard protocol after meetings of this nature, the organization's senior staff dispersing through different routes as a basic precautionary measure, nothing unusual about it, nothing that required acknowledgement. Seo Jun had implemented the protocol himself, years ago, for reasons that had everything to do with operational security and nothing whatsoever to do with the particular configuration of this specific evening. He noted, as the car pulled into the flow of the city's late afternoon traffic, that he was thinking about this more carefully than it warranted. The driver was Min's person, reliable, discreet, and professionally committed to the understanding that what happened in the back of this car was not something the front of the car had any awareness of. The partition was up. The city moved past the windows in the amber and gray of a Seoul evening descending toward dark, the light changing in the way it did at this hour, softening the hard geometry of the buildings into something almost atmospheric. Vanessa was looking out her window. She had been looking out her window since they got in, her legal pad closed on her knee, one hand resting on top of it, her posture the same as it always was, composed, self-contained, generating no particular signal. She was not performing calm. She was simply calm, the way she was simply everything, as a matter of settled internal fact rather than managed external presentation. Seo-jun was looking at the side of her face. He became aware of this approximately 4 seconds after it began and did not stop. There was, he recognized, a particular futility in the performance of indifference at this point. The evidence against it had been accumulating for weeks, and the events of the last hour had clarified the situation beyond any reasonable standard of deniability. He had walked into a room with one of the most perceptive men in the city, a man who had built a 61-year survival record on the precise and patient reading of other people's interior states, and had announced himself in the space of 4 seconds. Not through action. Through reflex. He had been read. And Oh Byung-soo had smiled like a man who had just received something valuable without having to pay for it. The operational implications of that were significant and he would need to address them. He would sit with Ryan tomorrow and they would discuss what Oh was likely to do with the information and how to position accordingly, and that conversation would be structured and manageable and would exist in the part of his world where he knew how to function. This, the back of a car, the amber light, the woman beside him looking out at a city that apparently required her full attention, this was not that part of his world. He had managed informants who were actively lying to him and maintained enough composure to extract the truth without revealing that he already had it. He had negotiated in rooms where the threat was not hypothetical, where the men across the table would have preferred him removed from the situation by any available means, and he had held his position and his expression with the same unbroken steadiness throughout. He had inherited an organization at 24, absorbed the loyalty of men 20 years his senior through sheer force of demonstrated competence, and had not once, in 5 years of running the most complex criminal architecture in the city, experienced the sensation currently occupying his chest. He looked at the line of her jaw. The way the fading light caught the pearl at her ear. The particular quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of someone waiting for something to happen but of someone who had arrived, fully, in the present moment and found it entirely sufficient. She was not thinking about him. He had no evidence for this and considerable evidence against it. She missed nothing, and she had been in that room, she had heard every word. She was not a person who processed things slowly, but from where he was sitting, at this precise moment, she appeared to be thinking about the city, or nothing at all, or something internal that had no reference to the man beside her. This was, he understood, the root of it. Every person in his world was oriented toward him in some fashion. That was the nature of the position. He was the center of a system, and systems organized themselves around their centers. He had learned to read that orientation, to account for it, to factor the wanting and the fearing and the calculating into every interaction as a baseline constant. He had forgotten, or perhaps had never known, what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who was simply and completely themselves, with no adjustment made for his proximity. Vanessa Hughes did not organize herself around him. She had her own center. It was located somewhere inside the composed, unreadable interior of a woman who had seen enough of the world to have formed her own conclusions about it, and those conclusions did not appear to include any particular renovation in response to Park Seo-jun. He could not locate himself in her. He had no coordinates. He had been trying to find them for weeks and arriving, each time, at the same absence, not rejection, not indifference, simply the reality of a person who was entirely elsewhere from the system he was used to operating in. He looked at her. She turned from the window. Not all the way. Just enough, a partial turn, the kind that acknowledges without committing, and for one moment her eyes moved from the city to the interior of the car and found him looking at her with an expression he had not had time to arrange. She held it for 2 seconds. Calm. Unreadable. Entirely clear-eyed. Then she looked back at the window. She said nothing. She did not shift in her seat or create distance or perform any of the adjustments that people made when they had been seen by someone whose attention made them uncertain. She simply returned to the city, and the light, and whatever interior place she occupied that he had no map for. Seo-jun looked forward. He had survived 14 years in a world that eliminated men who lost their footing. He had never lost his. He had not understood, until this moment, that footing could be lost not through confrontation but through something as quiet as a woman turning back to a window, and not needing, in any visible way, to turn back toward him. The car moved through Seoul. He said nothing. There was nothing, for the first time in recent memory, that he knew how to say. The building emptied in stages. First the junior staff, at 6, gathering their things with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the end of their working day and the end of Park Seojeon's were entirely separate events. Then Do-won and Choi, at 7, after a brief operational check-in that Seo-jun had kept shorter than usual without examining why. Then Ryan, at past, pausing in the doorway of Seojeon's office with the look of a man who had several things he could say and was applying his better judgment to all of them. Anything else tonight? No, Seo-jun said. Ryan left. Min was somewhere in the building. He was always somewhere in the building, a permanent, low-level operational presence that Seo-jun had long since stopped consciously registering. But the floor was quiet. The particular quality of quiet that a large space develops when the people who fill it in the day have gone, leaving the architecture to itself, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant percussion of the city 30 floors below, the specific stillness of expensive rooms after hours. Seo-jun was at his desk. The city was dark blue beyond the glass and the documents in front of him had been reviewed and were waiting for a decision he had been circling for 40 minutes, which was not how he made decisions, and he was aware of this, and he continued circling. She was still there. He knew this without looking. The light in the outer office had that occupied quality, not simply a lamp left on, but the particular luminous weight of a room that someone is using. He had heard no movement for some time, which with Vanessa meant nothing, only that she was working rather than navigating, but the presence was there, consistent and settled, the way it had been every morning and every evening for 6 weeks. She should have left an hour ago. He had not asked her to stay. He was certain of this. He had reviewed the day's outstanding items before 7 and there was nothing that required her tonight. Whatever she was finishing at her desk, she had identified it herself, determined it required completion, and remained to complete it without reference to whether he had noticed or whether he wanted her to. She was, as with most things, simply doing what she assessed needed to be done. He returned to the document. He read the same paragraph he had read 4 times. The decision it required was straightforward. He had known for 20 minutes what the correct answer was, and he continued not to formalize it, which was a behavior he associated with people who were avoiding something else in the room and not with himself. At 8:43, he heard her chair. The small, definitive sound of someone finishing, the drawer closing, the specific quality of movement that belongs to the end of a task rather than a pause in the middle of one. Then the soft weight of her standing, the brief interval of gathering, and then footsteps, unhurried, certain, the same cadence he had catalogued without meaning to across 6 weeks of mornings and evenings. He was looking at the document when she appeared in his peripheral vision, coat over one arm, bag at her shoulder, pausing in his doorway for the brief professional acknowledgement she offered each evening, a moment of presence that confirmed the day was closed, before continuing to the elevator. She was almost past the door when he said her name. Not her title. Not Ms. Hughes, the way he addressed her in meetings, in front of his men, in the operational language of their professional relationship. Not a summons, not a directive, not the particular register he used when he needed something from her. Just her name. Vanessa. She stopped. A beat of complete stillness, one foot already angled toward the corridor, her weight mid-transition, and then she turned back. Not all the way. The same partial turn she had made in the car, that measured rotation that acknowledged without committing, that gave him just enough of her face to see and held the rest in reserve. She looked at him. And something was different. In 6 weeks he had catalogued the ways she looked at things in this office, the operational assessment, the precise documentation of a problem being solved, the brief professional acknowledgement she offered him in passing. He knew her working eyes. He knew the particular quality of her attention when she was listening in a meeting and the different quality when she was simply being present in a room. This was neither of those things. She was looking at him the way she had in the car, in that 2-second interval before she turned back to the window, directly, without the professional filter, without the assessment overlay. Looking at him as a man rather than as a function. And there was something in it that he could not classify as quickly as he classified everything else, not warmth exactly, not the softness of invitation, but a kind of recognition. The look of a person who has been watching something develop with the patience of someone who understands that certain things cannot be rushed, and has arrived at the moment where the thing is ready to be acknowledged. She didn't speak. She didn't move toward him or shift the weight of her bag or make any of the small physical adjustments that would have indicated a decision being made. She simply held the doorway with the same self-contained steadiness she held everything, and she gave him the silence. Not an empty silence. A silence with a question in it, open, patient, with no deadline attached. The silence of a woman who had already decided what she was willing to answer and was waiting to see if he could find the words to ask. He looked at her across the quiet office and he knew what the question was, and he knew, with the same cold clarity that had served him in every other consequential moment of his adult life, exactly what his answer was. He didn't say it. Not tonight. The word was there, immediate and unambiguous, and he held it, not because he was uncertain, but because some things, said too quickly in doorways at the end of long evenings, became smaller in the saying than in the holding. He wanted to say it correctly. He wanted to say it in a way that was equal to what he meant. She waited 3 seconds. 4. Long enough to confirm she had offered it. Long enough that the absence of his answer was its own communication, received and understood without disappointment, without withdrawal, simply registered and filed in the composed interior of a woman who did not require things before they were ready. Then she turned. "Good night, Mr. Park," she said, and walked toward the elevator with the same unhurried certainty she brought to every other direction she moved in. He did not say good night. He sat in his office in the quiet she left and did not look at the document and did not make the decision and did not move for a considerable time. She had given him the question. He had no intention of leaving it unanswered. Only of answering it the way it deserved, completely, without the armor, in a room where there was no performance required from either of them. He would find the moment. He was, despite everything, still a man who knew how to wait for the right conditions before he made his move. What was different, now, was that he had never before waited for anything that felt this specific and this necessary and this much like the most important thing he had not yet said. It was a Friday, which meant nothing particular to the city but meant, in the operational rhythm of Seoul's world, that the week's accumulated weight had reached its natural terminus and the building had emptied with slightly more purpose than usual, people moving toward weekends, toward the versions of their lives that existed outside these floors, toward whatever it was that people moved toward when they were not here. Seo-jun had stayed. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he had stayed without work, the desk behind him cleared, the documents filed, the week's outstanding items closed with an efficiency that had taken him until 7 and had left him, afterward, with nothing in his hands and nowhere particular to direct his attention except the window and the city beyond it, which was doing what Seoul did on Friday evenings in the dark, burning quietly, continuously, indifferent and magnificent. He heard her before he turned. Not footsteps, she was already still when he registered her presence, which meant she had been at the window for some time before he came out of his office and found her there. She was standing at the far end of the glass, her coat still on, her bag nowhere visible, her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the city with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was genuinely considering rather than simply observing. The skyline threw its light against her, amber and white and the deep blue of a city at night, and she was very still inside it. He crossed the room. Not to his usual position, the center of the space, the place from which he habitually addressed everything in it. He walked to the window and stood beside her. Not behind her, not over her, not in any configuration that implied direction or management or the organizational geometry of their daily relationship. Beside her, at the same angle to the glass, looking at the same city, with approximately 12 inches of space between them that he made no move to close. She didn't turn. She acknowledged his presence the way she acknowledged most things, with a slight, almost imperceptible settling, a confirmation that she had registered him and was continuing anyway. He looked at the city for a moment. Then he spoke. "Every person in my life is a variable," he said. His voice was quiet, without the precision he used in meetings, without the particular calibration he applied when words were instruments. It was simply his voice, in a room where no one else was listening. I learned to do that early. You understand someone's needs, their fears, their pressure points, not to use against them, necessarily. Just to account for them. To know where they'll move before they move. It's how you stay ahead of a world that's always looking for the moment you're not. He paused. Below, the city continued its indifferent business. I cannot account for you. He said it the way he said things that were simply true, without apology, without the softening of a man hoping for a particular reception. I have been trying for 6 weeks. I have tried every framework I know and I arrive, every time, at the same result, which is that you don't fit into any of them. Not because you're complicated, you are probably the least complicated person in this building, in the sense that you simply are what you are, without variation, without the gap between the performed version and the actual one that exists in everyone else I've ever known. He turned from the window then. Not toward her, just away from the city, his shoulder angling slightly in her direction, his eyes finding the middle distance between the glass and the room. You make this feel like a cage, he said. The empire. All of it. I built it and I know every room of it and I have never once, until recently, felt the walls. Now I feel them constantly. A beat. And it is also, because you are in it, the only place I have any interest in being. I am aware that this is not a rational position. He stopped. Not because he had finished. There was more, there was considerably more, the full accumulated weight of 6 weeks of misclassified observations and deliberately inadequate explanations, but because he had reached the part where language became less accurate than silence, and he had enough respect for precision to recognize when he was at that edge. The city hummed below them. Vanessa turned. Not the partial turn, not the measured, withheld rotation that gave him a fraction of her face and held the rest in reserve. She turned fully, the way she had not done before, with all of her attention arriving in one movement, and she looked at him. He held it. The full weight of being seen by someone who saw accurately, not the mythology, not the position, not the managed surface of a man who had spent his adult life deciding exactly how much of himself to make visible. She looked at him the way she assessed everything, directly, without editorial, with the calm of someone who had already done the work of understanding and was now simply confirming what she'd found. I know, Seo-jun, she said. His name. Not Mr. Park, his name, in her voice, which he had heard precisely twice before and both times it had done something to the temperature of the room. I've known for a while. He exhaled. It moved through him from somewhere deeper than his chest, not the controlled release of a man managing his composure, but the real thing, the kind of exhale that belongs to a person setting something down that they have been carrying without knowing its weight until the moment it leaves their hands. He felt it go. The calculation, the reclassification, the weeks of inadequate language applied to things that had never required it. It was not defeat. It was the first breath he had taken in months that felt like it reached the bottom. He looked at her, all of her, present and clear-eyed and entirely herself in the Friday dark, and understood that he had been building toward this specific moment the way the city below had been building toward its skyline, incrementally, structurally, without knowing, until the thing was simply there and it was too large and too lit to look away from. And, he said. One word. The only one that mattered. Vanessa looked at him with the calm of a woman who had already made her decision, who had, he now understood, made it some time ago, and had been waiting with characteristic patience for him to arrive at the place where he could ask the question properly. She didn't answer immediately. She turned back to the window, and the city, and the Friday dark. But she didn't step away from him. And the 12 inches between them, which had been a careful and deliberate distance, was now something else entirely, not a gap, but a threshold. Present, acknowledged, belonging to both of them equally. He stood beside her and looked at Seoul and waited, for the first time in his life, without managing the waiting. Outside, the city burned on. Seoul did not ease into mornings. It arrived fully formed, loud, already committed, the traffic and commerce and 10,000 daily urgencies assembling themselves at a volume that made it clear the city had not paused overnight so much as rested briefly before resuming at full force. From the 32nd floor, the sound was filtered into something almost abstract, a low persistent frequency that Seo Jun had long since stopped hearing consciously, the way people stop hearing the sea after enough mornings waking beside it. He was at his desk by 6:45. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of his stillness, not the forward-leaning concentration of a man working through a problem, but something quieter, less directed. He had made coffee. He had opened the day's first documents and read the first page and then set it aside and looked at the city instead, the way he had been looking at things recently that he was allowing himself to simply see rather than immediately assess. At 7 o'clock, he heard the elevator. He did not look up. He listened, the doors, the familiar cadence in the corridor, the specific quality of presence that arrived before she was visible, the way it had arrived every morning for 6 weeks and had, every morning, altered something in the atmosphere of the floor in a way he had spent the first 3 weeks refusing to name and the last 3 weeks simply acknowledging without ceremony. Vanessa came through the outer office doorway. She was wearing dark gray today, a wool jacket, precisely fitted, over a white shirt, her hair up, the single pearl earrings she wore on days when the schedule was dense and the margins were narrow. She had not looked at the schedule yet this morning. She wore them on instinct, the way she did most things, with an internal accuracy that operated below the level of conscious calculation and arrived, consistently, at the correct answer. She set her bag down. Removed her jacket. Settled into her chair with the same unhurried certainty she had brought to that chair on the very first morning, not the certainty of someone who had earned the right to be comfortable, but of someone who had never required permission for it in the first place. She opened her notebook. She uncapped her pen. Nothing about her had changed. This was the thing that struck him, watching from his desk through the open door, the complete and unbroken consistency of her. 6 weeks of mornings and she was the same person in the same chair with the same quality of presence she had produced on the first day, before she knew the building's rhythms or the names of his men or the particular geography of his operational world. She had not adjusted to him. She had simply been herself, continuously, and it was his world that had adjusted, quietly, structurally, in ways that had become so fundamental he could no longer clearly remember what the architecture had felt like before she was inside it. He stood up. He had prepared the document the previous evening, after the city had settled into its late-night register and the building had gone fully quiet, and he had sat at his desk with a single lamp and written, with more care than he had applied to any legal instrument in recent memory, something that was not a legal instrument at all. It was 1 page. He had rewritten it twice, not because the content changed but because the first version was too constructed, the second too sparse, and the third was simply honest, which was what it needed to be. He picked it up from the desk. He walked to the outer office. Vanessa looked up when he appeared in the doorway, the brief, professional acknowledgement, the readiness of a woman expecting the first directive of the day. He crossed to her desk. She watched him come with the attentive calm she brought to everything, her pen still in her hand, her expression open and unhurried. He placed the document in front of her. Not in the manner of an instruction or a briefing, not positioned for her to act on but simply set before her, the way you place something in front of someone when you are asking rather than directing. He stepped back 1 pace and put his hands in his pockets and looked at a point on her desk slightly to the left of the document, which was the closest he could come, at this particular moment, to looking elsewhere. She looked down. He watched her read it. She did not read quickly or slowly. She read at the pace of someone reading carefully, which meant once, fully, without skimming the parts that required sitting with. He had written it plainly, that he was not a man who had ever asked for anything that did not fit inside the operational logic of his world, and that she did not fit inside that logic, and he had stopped trying to make her, and that what he was asking was not for her to become part of the empire but to let him, in whatever way she would allow and at whatever pace she determined, build something alongside her that was separate from it, smaller, quieter, and worth considerably more. He had not used the word love. He had not been ready for it to be that small on a page. But the document said what it meant, clearly, and she was not a person who required translation. She finished reading. She set the document down on the desk in front of her, squaring the edges with the same precise, habitual care she applied to everything that passed through her hands. Then she looked up at him. The expression was the one he had first seen across an interview table 7 weeks ago, calm, unreadable, entirely self-possessed, the face of a woman who had assessed the situation fully and was not in any hurry to perform her response to it. The expression that had, in the intervening weeks, become the fixed point around which his entire world had silently reorganized. He held it. She held it. Then she looked down at the document, and she picked up her pen, and she signed her name at the bottom with the same unhurried certainty with which she did everything, not quickly, as though rushing to confirm before she reconsidered, but fully and deliberately, the signature of a woman who had made her decision some time ago and was now simply making it legible. She capped the pen. She placed it on the desk beside the document. She looked back up at him. Seo-jun pulled the chair from the opposite side of her desk, not his chair, not the configuration of their professional relationship, just the nearest chair, and sat down. Across from her, at her desk, at her level, with the document between them and the city behind the glass and the morning already loud and already dangerous in the way that mornings in his world always were. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was no ceremony to it. No declaration, no gesture calibrated for significance. Just two people sitting across from each other in an office on the 32nd floor of a building that belonged, in every documented and undocumented sense, to one of the most dangerous men in the city, and the understanding, shared and quiet and requiring no further elaboration, that something had been established here that was not in any of the documentation. Something that would not appear in any filing, any contract, any of the layered legal structures that defined and protected everything else he had built. Something that needed none of that because it was, already, the most structurally sound thing in the room. He had spent 29 years constructing an empire on the premise that power was the only foundation worth building on. He had not understood, had not had the information to understand, that power without a center was simply a very large and very expensive form of being alone. The city moved below them, loud and indifferent and entirely unaware. Park Seo-jun sat across from the only person who had ever seen him clearly, and stayed anyway, and thought, this is what it was all for. Not the empire. This. The morning light came through the glass and settled over her desk and the signed document and the coffee that was going cold at her elbow, and for the first time in the long operational history of this office, the room felt less like a command center than a beginning. He reached across the desk and turned the document so it faced him. He read his own words once, briefly, and then he folded it in half and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where he kept the things that mattered most and trusted least to the filing systems of the world. Vanessa watched him do this. Then she opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, and said, with the calm efficiency of a woman beginning an ordinary workday, "You have a call at 8. Ryan needs 15 minutes before that. And your coffee is getting cold." Seo-jun looked at her. He almost smiled. "I know," he said. And the day began. If this story got under your skin, subscribe so the next one finds you. Like it. Share it with someone who needs a slow burn that actually pays off. And drop a comment, which moment got you first. I read every one. See you in the next story.